Midnight has a sound that only the broken and the patient can hear. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives slowly like a held breath finally released. That was the moment everything changed for me. My name is Olivia, and at exactly 12 that night, I understood something that would later change the balance of every room I ever walked into. I was never weak. I was only quiet. And there is a difference that people learn too late, I remember. Sitting alone in my apartment, lights off, city noise slipping through the window like distant waves. My phone was face down on the table, silent in a way that felt heavier than any argument. Hours earlier, I had still been part of something. A team, a circle. A family they used to call it. By midnight, I had already been erased. No warning. No explanation, just absence. They had removed me from the group chat. I noticed because the name disappeared, not because anyone told me. My access to shared files was gone. Passwords changed. Meetings rescheduled without my knowledge. It happened cleanly, efficiently, like I had never existed. People think betrayal comes with drama, with raised voices and slammed doors. They are wrong. Real betrayal is quiet. It happens when you are not looking, by people who know exactly how much silence you can endure. I did not cry. Not then. That surprised me. Instead, I felt something settle inside my chest, calm and heavy, like a decision being made without words. I stared at the dark reflection in the window and asked myself a simple question. How long had they been planning this? The answer came slowly, piece by piece, as memories rearranged themselves in my mind. The missed messages, the sudden distance. The way conversations stopped when I entered the room. The compliments that felt rehearsed. The smiles that did not reach the eyes. I had noticed all of it, but I chose to believe in loyalty because it was easier than believing I was being prepared for removal. I had been useful once. That was the part they would never deny. I built systems no one else understood. I fixed problems that did not come with credit. I stayed late so others could leave early. I smoothed conflicts, absorbed pressure, took responsibility when things went wrong. I believed contribution created security. I believed effort would protect me. That belief was my only mistake. When you make yourself essential, people do not always value you more. Sometimes they just look for a way to replace you. Quietly. And when they finally do, they convince themselves you deserve it. I thought back to the early days when my phone never stopped ringing, when my opinion mattered, when my presence was requested, not tolerated. Back then, they listened when I spoke. They asked for my thoughts. They thanked me publicly and relied on me privately. I mistook dependency for respect. Over time, the shift was subtle. A meeting moved without notice. A decision announced after it was already final. A joke at my expense followed by laughter that asked me to join in on my own notice of demotion. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself not to be sensitive. I told myself strong people adapt. So I adapted by shrinking. I spoke less. I shared fewer ideas. I stopped correcting mistakes that were not mine. I watched as others took credit for work I had done, using my words with different voices. I watched as my role became smaller without anyone saying it out loud. And still I stayed. People often ask why someone stays in a place that is clearly pushing them out. The answer is simple and painful. Hope that effort will be seen. Hope that loyalty will be returned. Hope that silence will be rewarded. Hope can be dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. The night they removed me, I replayed every interaction from the past few months. I realized the truth I had been avoiding. They did not remove me because I was weak. They removed me because I was no longer controllable. I had learned too much. I had seen too clearly. And worst of all, I had stopped reacting. Silence makes people nervous when they expect fear. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages, promises, appreciation, statements about trust and future plans. None of it mattered now. Words are cheap when power shifts. What mattered was what they thought of me at that moment. They believed I would panic. They believed I would call, beg, demand answers. They believed I would expose my hurt and give them confirmation that they had won. I did none of those things. Instead, I made tea and sat at the table, letting the quiet stretch. I felt sadness, yes, but it did not control me. Underneath it was clarity, a sharp, focused awareness that comes when illusions finally collapse. I understood the rules now. I understood that fairness was never part of the system. Only leverage. They thought midnight was the end of my story. For me, it was the beginning of my preparation. The following days were strange. My absence went unnoticed publicly, but privately I could sense confusion. Small messages came in from people on the edges, asking neutral questions that were really tests. How are you doing? Have you heard anything? Are you still involved? I answered politely and vaguely. I gave them nothing they could report back. That was when I realized how closely they were watching me. They expected anger. They expected chaos. They expected me to make noise. When I did not, they filled the silence with their own assumptions. People always do. And the assumptions they made would later become my greatest advantage. I went through my files calmly. Backups they forgot existed. Records they assumed I had deleted. Timelines that showed exactly who did what and when. I did not rush. I did not act. I simply observed. Revenge, I learned, is not about striking first. It is about waiting until the truth becomes heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. At night, alone again, I allowed myself to feel what I had postponed. The sadness came in waves, not dramatic, not loud. Just a deep ache of disappointment. I had trusted people who saw my loyalty as a weakness. I had protected people who were already planning my exit. Accepting that hurt more than being removed. But pain has a strange effect when you do not run from it. It sharpens your focus. I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what I still had. My skills, my knowledge, my reputation outside their small circle, my ability to stay composed under pressure. Most importantly, my understanding of how they operated. They had shown me their playbook without realizing it. Weeks passed. The world did not end. That surprised me too. Life continued. New routines formed. New conversations opened. Opportunities I had ignored before now felt visible. And still, I stayed quiet. People underestimate quiet people because they confuse silence with surrender. They do not realize that silence is often where plans are refined. One evening, I ran into someone who used to work closely with us. Someone who had left earlier under circumstances that suddenly felt familiar. We talked cautiously at first, then more openly. Our stories matched in ways that were impossible to ignore. The same patterns, the same justifications, the same sudden distancing followed by removal. It was not personal. It was systematic. That realization changed everything. I was not dealing with emotional chaos. I was dealing with a structure that relied on control, fear, and disposability. And structures like that have one fatal flaw. They depend on silence from the people they discard. I had already broken that pattern by surviving quietly. The more distance I gained, the clearer my thinking became. I saw how often I had softened truths to keep peace. How often I had carried responsibility that was never meant to be mine. How often I had been the shield for decisions made by others. Removing me did not remove the problems. It only removed the person who managed them. And slowly, predictably, cracks began to appear. Small issues turned into delays. Delays turned into mistakes. Mistakes turned into tension. I watched from a distance, not with joy, but with understanding. This was the cost of underestimating the wrong person. I did not interfere. I did not warn anyone. I let them learn. Midnight came again, many times after that first one. Each time I felt stronger. Not louder, stronger. Strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. I knew there would be a moment when our paths crossed again. When they would realize that removing me had not erased me. That moment would not be dramatic. It would be subtle. A question they could not answer. A problem they could not fix. A realization that arrived too late. I was not in a hurry. I had learned patience from the same people who thought they were teaching me obedience. And when that moment came, they would finally understand what midnight taught me first. I was never weak. This was only the beginning. The silence I kept was not empty. It was busy. While they assumed I was recovering or struggling or regretting my quiet exit, I was rebuilding something inside myself that I had neglected for a long time. Confidence without permission. Direction without approval. I woke up each day without the weight of expectation pressing on my chest. And that freedom made my thoughts clearer than they had been in years. At first, I stayed away from anything connected to them. Not out of fear, but out of discipline. Distance gives perspective, and I needed to see the full picture without emotion blurring the edges. I spent my mornings reviewing old work, not with nostalgia, but with honesty. I noticed how often my instincts had been right. How many times I had prevented problems that no one even knew existed. How much invisible labor I had contributed. Believing that being indispensable would protect me, what I learned instead was this: being indispensable makes people want to control you, not value you. As days turned into weeks, small signs started reaching me. Not directly, never directly. It was always through someone else, a casual mention that things felt disorganized, a comment about confusion over responsibilities, the question wrapped in politeness, asking if I remembered how something worked. I answered only what was necessary, enough to be kind, never enough to be useful. That restraint was difficult. I had spent so long being the fixer that refusing to fix felt unnatural. But every time I resisted the urge, I reminded myself why I was here. I was no longer responsible for holding together something that had already decided I was disposable. One afternoon, an unexpected email arrived. It was brief, carefully worded, neutral in tone. The sender thanked me for my past contributions and asked if I would be open to a short conversation to clear the air. I read it twice, then closed my laptop without responding. Not yet. People often think power is loud. They imagine confrontation, dominance, control. But real power is timing. And my timing was not aligned with their comfort. I let the message sit unanswered for 3 days. I imagined the conversations happening on their side, the questions, the impatience, the growing awareness that I was no longer reacting on cue. Silence unsettles those who rely on predictable responses. It forces them to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty is where control starts to slip. When I finally replied, I kept it simple, polite, professional, non-committal. I thanked them for reaching out and said I was currently focused on other priorities, but wished them well. No bitterness, no explanation. Just boundaries. The response came faster than the first message. More words this time, more warmth. A subtle shift in tone, as if they were trying to remind me of a shared history. I felt nothing but clarity. Shared history does not excuse shared harm. That was the moment I understood something important. They did not miss me. They missed what I provided. At night, when the world quieted down, I allowed myself to reflect deeper. I thought about how easily people rewrite narratives when they need to protect their image. How quickly loyalty becomes inconvenience. How often silence is mistaken for consent. I realized I had been giving people access to parts of me they had not earned. That realization did not make me angry. It made me precise. I started rebuilding my professional presence carefully, not publicly, not dramatically, just enough to be visible in the right places. I reconnected with people who had respected my work without exploiting it. I shared insights selectively. I listened more than I spoke. Every step was intentional. Opportunities began to appear. Real ones, not rushed, not desperate. Invitations to collaborate, conversations that felt balanced, questions that were followed by listening. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I had to prove my worth. It was already understood. Meanwhile, from what I heard, things were unraveling slowly on the other side. Not in a way that caused immediate collapse, but in a way that exposed weaknesses. Deadlines missed. Decisions questioned. Accountability shifting uncomfortably between people who were no longer sure who was responsible for what. I did not celebrate this. I observed it. There is a difference. One evening, I received a message from someone I trusted. Someone who had stayed quiet just like me. They told me the truth I had already suspected. My removal had not solved the issues they claimed it would. It had simply removed the person who absorbed the impact. Without me there, the pressure had nowhere to go. That was when the guilt attempts began, subtle at first. References to how things used to work. Comments about how everyone makes mistakes. Invitations framed as olive branches. I recognized the pattern. It was not reconciliation they wanted. It was relief. I declined every invitation with grace. I did not expose anyone. I did not accuse. I simply refused to step back into a system that had shown me its limits. Refusal is powerful when done without explanation. As time passed, I noticed a shift in how my name was spoken. Less dismissive, more cautious. I was no longer a background figure they could rewrite freely. I had become an unknown variable, and unknown variables make people uncomfortable. I focused on strengthening myself instead of weakening others. I learned new skills. I refined old ones. I invested energy where it returned value, not promises. Slowly, my confidence stopped being reactive and became rooted. One night, while organizing old notes, I came across a sentence I had written months before everything collapsed. It said, "If I leave, they will fall apart." At the time, I had dismissed it as arrogance. Now I saw it for what it was. Awareness. I did not need to prove it. Reality was already doing that for me. Another message arrived weeks later. This one was different, less polished, more honest. It admitted challenges. It asked directly if I would consider consulting, even temporarily. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding, not because I was tempted, but because I finally understood the position I was in. They were asking from weakness. I was answering from strength. I declined again, this time firmly but respectfully. I explained that my values no longer aligned with their direction. That was the truth. It was enough. After that, the messages stopped. What replaced them was something far more satisfying: peace, not the fragile kind that depends on external approval, but the steady kind that comes from self-respect. I slept better. I spoke more honestly. I trusted my instincts again, and then quietly, without announcement, the moment I had anticipated arrived. I walked into a professional gathering one evening, unprepared for who I might see because I no longer planned my life around avoiding ghosts. The room was full, conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling. And then I noticed the pause, that brief hesitation people have. When they are not sure how to act, they saw me. Their expressions shifted from surprise to calculation. I met their eyes calmly, without challenge, without warmth, just presence. The kind that does not need to explain itself. In that moment, I knew. They finally understood that removing me had not diminished me. It had revealed them. And this time, midnight was no longer my lesson alone. I did not approach them that evening, and they did not approach me. We existed in the same space like parallel lines, aware of each other, careful not to collide. I could feel their attention without looking, the way people sense a shift in the air before a storm. It was strange how something that once would have made my heart race now felt distant, almost academic. Time and distance had done their work. I was no longer emotionally available to their reactions. As I moved through the room, conversations flowed easily. People listened when I spoke. They asked questions and waited for answers. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed my ideas. That contrast was not lost on me. Respect, I realized, is not demanded. It is offered naturally when people see clarity and confidence in someone who is not seeking approval. Later, as I stood near a window overlooking the city lights, someone from their side finally approached. Their smile was careful, their tone measured, as if every word had been rehearsed. They spoke about the weather, about the event, about neutral things that avoided the real subjects sitting between us. I responded politely, keeping my voice steady and brief. I did not fill the silence when it appeared. I let it do its work. Eventually, they mentioned how busy things had been lately. How challenging, how unexpected issues kept coming up. The invitation was clear. They wanted me to ask questions. They wanted me to offer solutions. They wanted reassurance. I gave none of it. Instead, I nodded and said I hoped things improved. Disappointment flickered across their face before they masked it. That flicker was not victory for me, it was confirmation. They were still measuring my value by what I could fix for them. And I was done being measured that way. After that night, the energy shifted again. The indirect messages resumed, but with a different tone, less entitlement, more uncertainty. They had realized I was no longer available in the role they had assigned me. And people who lose control often try to regain it through narratives. I heard rumors about myself soon after. That I had left because I could not handle pressure. That I was difficult to work with. That I had been removed for reasons they could not fully explain. None of it surprised me. When people cannot control the truth, they reshape it. What did surprise me was how little it affected me. Had spent so long protecting my reputation within a small circle that I had forgotten something important. My reputation was larger than them. It existed in the work I had done, the relationships I had built, and the consistency of my character over time. One group's version of events cannot erase that. Still, I did not counter the rumors directly. I let my actions speak where my words no longer needed to. People who mattered noticed the consistency. People who did not were never going to be convinced anyway. As months passed, the contrast between our trajectories became clearer. My work deepened. My confidence solidified. I was invited into spaces where strategy mattered, where decisions were made carefully, where accountability was shared instead of shifted. I learned what it felt like to be trusted without being used. On their side, from what I could see, the instability continued. Turnover increased, responsibilities blurred. The same problems appeared again and again under different names. Without a central point of quiet control, the system struggled to regulate itself. That was not something I took pride in. It was simply the natural result of removing a stabilizing element without replacing it. One evening, a former colleague reached out unexpectedly. Not with apologies or explanations, but with curiosity. They asked how I had managed to move on so smoothly. How I seemed unaffected. I thought carefully before answering. I told them the truth. I said I had stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. That answer stayed with them longer than anything else I could have said. That conversation made me reflect on how often we exhaust ourselves trying to correct perceptions that are intentionally wrong. Letting go of that effort had freed an enormous amount of energy inside me. Energy I could finally use for myself. Then came the moment that shifted everything from quiet distance to undeniable clarity. A public situation arose. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just a decision that required knowledge only I had possessed. A situation where my absence was no longer invisible. People outside their circle noticed inconsistencies. Questions were asked. Explanations fell short. For the first time, my name was mentioned not as a rumor, but as a reference point. They could not avoid it. I was contacted again. This time by someone higher up, someone who had previously stayed neutral. Their message was respectful, direct, and cautious. They acknowledged my past role. They asked if I would be willing to clarify certain matters. Not for blame, but for understanding. I agreed to speak, not because I owed anyone closure, but because truth, when spoken calmly, has a way of rearranging power. The conversation was brief and factual. I explained processes. I clarified timelines. I described responsibilities exactly as they had been. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I simply stated what was. When asked why certain safeguards were no longer in place, I answered, honestly, because I was no longer there. Silence followed. That silence was different from the one I had kept before. This time it was theirs. After that conversation, things changed rapidly. Decisions were revisited. Roles were questioned. Accountability could no longer be deflected. I remained on the outside observing, unaffected by the turbulence my clarity had created. Some people assume revenge must be aggressive to be effective. They imagine confrontation and exposure. But the most effective form of revenge is stability. It is living well, clearly, and truthfully while others scramble to maintain illusions. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to defend myself. Reality did that for me. Weeks later, I encountered one of them again, alone this time, without an audience. Their posture was different, less certain. They spoke my name softly, as if testing its weight. They admitted, without saying it directly, that things had gone wrong. I listened. I said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful response is allowing people to hear themselves. As I walked away from that encounter, I felt something close to relief. Not because they had acknowledged anything, but because I no longer needed them. 2. My sense of worth was no longer tied to their recognition. Midnight came again, as it always does. But this time, it did not bring questions. It brought confirmation I had survived the betrayal without becoming bitter. I had reclaimed my voice without shouting. I had learned that strength does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like restraint. And the story was not over yet, because clarity has a way of pulling truth to the surface. And when it does, there is no place left to hide. After that, the world felt quieter in a different way. Not the tense silence of uncertainty, but the calm that comes when something unresolved finally settles. I noticed how little space they occupied in my thoughts now. What once felt heavy had become distant, like a chapter one could reference without reliving. That was when I understood that healing does not always arrive as relief. Sometimes it arrives as indifference. Still, life has a way of bringing unfinished lessons back when you least expect them. I began receiving invitations to speak, not on stages or under spotlights, but in rooms where decisions were shaped quietly. People wanted to understand how systems fail when trust is misplaced, how stability erodes when control replaces respect. I spoke honestly without bitterness. I described patterns, not people. The focus is always on learning, not blame, each time I spoke, I felt more grounded. My voice was steady because I was no longer trying to convince anyone of my value. I was simply sharing what I knew. Meanwhile, the situation they were dealing with grew more complicated. External pressure mounted. Expectations rose. The small cracks I'd observed earlier widened into visible fractures. Leadership changed hands. Priorities shifted. The structure that once felt immovable now looked fragile. I was not watching closely, but news travels fast when history is involved. People mentioned my name carefully, as if acknowledging it carried weight. That awareness was strange, but it also felt earned. Not because I had planned for it, but because I had stayed consistent when it mattered. One evening, I received a request that surprised me. It was formal, detailed. It asked for my perspective in writing, on record. The tone was respectful, almost cautious. I took my time before responding. I read it slowly, making sure I understood not just what was being asked, but why that they were no longer trying to fix problems quietly. They were preparing to answer for them. I agreed under one condition, that my words would not be edited for convenience, that they would stand exactly as written. They accepted. Writing that statement was not difficult. I did not need to search. For the right tone, I wrote calmly, clearly, and precisely. I outlined what I had been responsible for, what decisions had been made without me, and what happened after my removal. I did not name individuals. I did not assign motives. I simply described cause and effect. When I finished, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I expected anything from it, but because I had finally spoken without fear of consequence. The truth no longer felt dangerous. The response was quiet. Too quiet, no immediate reactions, no follow-up questions. Just acknowledgement. Then, slowly, the consequences began to unfold. Processes were restructured. Oversight increased. Certain narratives were quietly abandoned. People who had once spoken with certainty now spoke with care. I noticed how often my earlier warnings, once dismissed as caution, were now repeated as wisdom. That irony did not make me bitter. It made me grateful I had not stayed. A message arrived one night from someone who had once stood against me openly. They did not apologize. They did not explain. They simply said they understood now. I read it once and closed it. Understanding, I had learned, is not the same as accountability. By this point, my life had moved in directions I could not have imagined during those final days before my removal. I was working with people who valued clarity. I was trusted not because I was quiet, but because I was consistent. The difference mattered, yet there was one last encounter waiting. It happened unexpectedly, in a small, quiet space far from formal settings. They looked tired, not defeated, but worn in a way that comes from carrying weight without support. For the first time, there was no performance, no strategy. Just honesty. They spoke about pressure, about fear, about mistakes they could not undo. They did not ask for forgiveness. They did not ask me to return. They only spoke. I listened. And in that moment, I realized something important. Revenge had never been my goal. If it had been, I would have acted from anger. Instead, I had chosen distance, clarity, and restraint. The outcome was not destruction. It was exposure. Exposure does not always ruin people. Sometimes it forces them to face themselves. When they finished speaking, I told them the truth. I said I hoped they learned from what had happened. I said I had learned too. And I said goodbye. As I walked away, I felt no urge to look back. There was nothing left behind that belonged to me. That night, when midnight arrived again, it felt different from the first time. There was no ache, no tension. Just awareness. Midnight was no longer a moment of loss. It was a marker of growth. I had been underestimated because I was quiet. I had been removed because I did not fit a narrative of control. And I had survived because I refused to become what betrayal tried to make me. The lesson was clear now. Strength does not always reveal itself through confrontation. Sometimes it reveals itself through patience, through dignity, through the courage To walk away without explanation, and the story was nearing its end, because every story of betrayal eventually becomes a story of self-respect, and that is where mine was heading. By the time everything settled, I no longer measured my life by what had been taken from me. I measured it by what I had refused to lose: my integrity, my calm, my ability to see clearly even when emotions tried to blur the edges. Those things stayed with me, quietly shaping every decision I made after. People often think closure comes from answers, from apologies, from admissions of guilt. I learned that real closure comes from understanding your own value without needing it confirmed by the people who failed to see it. I stopped waiting for conversations that would never happen in the way I once imagined. I stopped replaying moments, wondering what I could have done differently. The past had already taught me what it needed to teach. What surprised me most was how often people began to seek my perspective, not because of what I had endured, but because of how I had handled it. They noticed that I did not speak with resentment, that I did not position myself as a victim, that I spoke with balance. Pain loses its power when you turn it into insight instead of identity. I built a life that felt honest. My days were no longer driven by urgency or fear of being left behind. I chose my work carefully. I chose my alliances even more carefully. I paid attention to how people treated others when no benefit was attached. I listened not just to words, but to patterns. And in that process, I became someone I trusted. Occasionally, echoes of the past surfaced. A familiar name mentioned in passing, a situation that mirrored old dynamics. Each time, I noticed how different my response was. There was no tightening in my chest, no instinct to prove myself, just awareness. Awareness is what remains when wounds have healed into wisdom. I understood now why silence had been my greatest strength. Silence had allowed me to observe without being entangled, to plan without being rushed, to leave without burning bridges that did not need fire to fall apart. Silence had protected me when speaking would have exposed me too early. There is a strange dignity in letting people believe their version of you, especially when you no longer live there. I let them keep their stories. I did not need to correct them. My life had moved beyond their reach. One night, long after everything had ended, I stood by the same window where I had once stared at my reflection in disbelief. The city lights looked the same, but I did not. I felt steady, grounded, complete in a way that had nothing to do with success or validation. Midnight arrived quietly as always. I smiled, not because I had won something over someone else, but because I had reclaimed something for myself, my sense of direction, my ability to trust my instincts, my understanding that strength does not require noise. If there is one truth this journey left me with, it is this: being underestimated is not a curse. It is an opportunity to move without resistance, to grow without interference, to rise without announcement. They thought removing me would erase my influence. What it actually did was release it. I did not become louder. I became clearer. And clarity, once achieved, cannot be taken away. This is what Midnight taught me in the end. That betrayal does not define you. Your response to it does. That silence can be a weapon, a shield, and a sanctuary all at once. And that walking away with dignity is sometimes the most powerful statement you will ever make. My name is Olivia, and I was never weak. If this story made you feel something, if any part of Olivia's journey reflected a moment from your own life, then pause for a second and let that feeling settle. Stories like this are not just entertainment. They are reminders that silence can be strength, patience can be power, and dignity always leaves the deepest impact. If you believe more people need to hear stories about betrayal, resilience, and quiet revenge, support this channel by liking this video. It helps these stories reach the ones who need them most. Share it with someone who is staying silent right now, someone who is being underestimated, someone who needs to remember their worth. Subscribe to the channel if you want more cinematic stories about justice, self-respect, and rising without shouting. New stories are coming, and each one carries a lesson worth hearing. And before you go, leave a comment. Not just a word, but a thought. Tell us what Midnight taught you.